he sheds light on the mysteries which have us all searching together. All right, well, welcome everybody. I'm your host for tonight, Justin James Garcia. I can't quite hear the music that's playing in the radio chat room, so unfortunate. Not sure the exact timing of when we're supposed to be coming on prayerfully. I'm not speaking over anything over there, but for everybody that is joining on our YouTube live stream, welcome. It's awesome to see you all again. If you are just joining over on Revolution Radio, please do check us out over at youtube.com/ZenGarcia. You can join us for this live Ask Me Anything with author and researcher Gary Wayne. This is our monthly Ask Me Anything with Brother Gary, and this is our 36th episode. I'm excited to continue on this series, and yeah, we do have a pre-made list of 14 questions, but we are taking questions from the live YouTube chat. Those will get added to a list for the end of the show. Towards the end of the show, normally Brother Gary has plenty of time to get to some of the live questions from the chat. So if you are writing your question in the chat, please do follow suit like Facts Not Fiction did right there. Just throw question in front. That way I know, okay, this is a question for the AMA, and I'll throw that on the list, and we'll get to those if possible. And if not, we will add them to the list for next month's show. So we do always take those 14 questions from the pre-made list before we get into the live questions. So got some really great questions tonight, and without further ado, let's go ahead and bring on Brother Gary. How are you doing, sir?
Very, very good, and so happy to be back and looking forward to providing answers to the questions and taking as many questions from the chat room as we can possibly squeeze in. It's always a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely always appreciate you joining us for these 2 hours and for answering all the questions. You know, there's such a large variety of questions that always come your way, and I'm always grateful that you're able to join us and share your perspective and the insight that you've garnered from your research. So you have put together a really awesome book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and that is an amazing book. I know you're also working on your second book. Where could the audience find out more information or get a copy of your book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy?
The best place to get a hold of my book, I think, is through my website. That's the Genesis6conspiracy.com, Genesis 6 with the number 6conspiracy.com. And on the website, I have a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters, so you'll get a good feel for the book, whether or not it's for you or not. And don't worry, that is just a small piece of the information on there that is posted up there that's actually in the book. And you can buy a copy from the website by clicking on the Buy Now icon and get a signed copy from myself. And just I need to do this a little bit more regularly just to be it. One of the things that happens on a regular basis is that sometimes the credit card gets declined, and that's in most cases it's going to be because the credit card company has a security code for fraud on there, and that it doesn't permit foreign purchases. I live in Canada. I ship out of Canada. So if your card gets declined and you can't figure out why, it's just because the credit card company may have a hold on it. You just get a hold of them and they'll take that hold off. So that's the best way to get a signed copy. And if you wanted to get one from Amazon.com or Amazon.ca or BarnesandNoble.com, or go over to and get the digital version at Kindle, you can click over on the buy page there as well. And for I have 3 different pages up there. I have one that's for Canada, I have one for the US, and then I have one for overseas, which was a recent addition I did on the upgrade on my website this year for the overseas group. So if you're listening overseas and you're looking to get a copy of the book, that's the best way to get it. It's not always available overseas. In some locations, maybe in Australia and in Britain it is, but other countries it may not be. So so that's the best way to get a hold of me, as well as also through the website. And the only social media I'm doing today is Facebook. And if you want to get a hold of me through Messenger and ask me a question, that's the best way to do it.
Excellent. We definitely appreciate all the efforts that you put out there for the ministry. So out any more pause, let's jump over into this pre-made list of questions. We have some really great questions tonight, and I'm excited to hear your answers. Yeah, if you do have your question in the chat, I am monitoring, so no need to write it more than once. Just make sure you throw that big question at the front. That way I know that it's a question that you would like for the pre-made list. But great questions. Keep them coming, everyone. We love all of your questions. And yeah, so let's get into the first one that comes from Andrew Findlay. Gary, are you familiar with Michael Levin, the Tufts professor doing research on bioelectric network software, informing our DNA hardware as to what to do? Very Revelation 9:6 stuff.
Yeah, very interesting question, Andrew. And no, I was not familiar with Michael Levin or the Tufts University professor and the work that he did. So I did a little Google on it to see what he might be doing. And very interesting for sure. So in this age of technology that's developing at a pace that is really mind-boggling, and behind closed doors, probably even at a pace that we can't even imagine. And we may not want to imagine it might get to be that sort of scary. And this may be one of those kinds of research that's going on. So just to get people sort of up to date on what Andrew is referring to in Revelation 9:6, I'll just read what it says there. And it says, "And in those days shall men seek death and shall not find it, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee them." So people are going to be seeking death, but they're not going to find it. And that's because in verse 5, just before it, we have these scorpion beings that are fallen angels of some sort, or some sort of lower warrior type of god, that are coming out of the abyss with Abaddon and Apollyon as their leader. And they're going to sting people with their tail, and it's going to torment people. And it's going to be like the torment that a scorpion bite does for 5 months, and so much so that people are going to seek death. So we don't get that word torment as it goes back to this one particular word. It doesn't happen very often, just in the book of Revelation. And in Revelation 14:11, where the people who take the mark of the beast, that's where we find out that first that they're going to, for those consequences, burn in the lake of fire forever and be tormented there. So you might look at it as that kind of torment, that these burning sensations might be that come with this scorpion sting. And also that Babylon in Revelation 18:7 tortures the world. And what's interesting as well is that Babylon deceives all of the people through the sorceries, through pharmakeia, and all of the derivative words that sort of come down into us from pharmakeia, like pharmaceutical and everything associated with that. It's going to be part of Babylon's deceptions. And so Babylon is tormenting the whole world, but it's the same word, but it just seems to be a little bit more specific as to what is being talked about in Revelation 9, 5, and 6. So this is a torment that is going to be so horrible that people are going to seek death. So let's just talk a little bit then quickly about what is Michael Levin's research all about. And it's about what they call bioelectricity. And it's how cells network and perform computations to coordinate activity. So there's all of this coordinated bioelectric activity that goes amongst the cells to work together and to work towards anatomical targets. And so it's combining that sort of power and influencing things through a conglomerate of a number of cells, which is really kind of interesting sort of stuff, and kind of scary that they're working into that technology to understand that software and how those computations take place. And it's like, okay, if there's computations taking place, that means it's probably almost intelligent, something that's going on there that's beyond our understanding, that is almost like an AI type of thing, or something that comes from the body and the brain that would be guiding all of this, which is really interesting sort of stuff. And that it is almost digital. So just as we're starting to see digital things that are being used to help prevent pestilence these days, this is kind of a similar sort of idea, where that ultimate implant system is going to be going to this digital sort of network. But what is going on in Revelation 9 is something different. It's like this attack with these scorpions. And so it's either a poison, or it's some sort of digital technology that comes from the tail that is going to, in what Andrew is referring to, be coordinated through hitting the cells in some sort of, I don't know, virus that may be put in, but would have an activity towards collectively bringing pain to the targets that it's chasing within the cellular structure of the body, is how I would imagine it. So this could be very advanced super weaponry that is kind of modeled after how the body works, but now corrupted, as the sciences always become corrupted with the spurious forces. And we're going to see so much of this in the end time. And that it's now being corrupted to take that concept, to inject something that is going to perform its own computations and to coordinate and take over cells, perhaps like a cancer virus does, and then to target this poison or this digital pain towards particular targets of the body that would probably be designed to excrete the most pain. So if you wanted to take it to a sort of top level technological weapon, that's how I might look at it. And so there's this communication that's going on in this digital technology, probably not only within the body, but in terms of maybe some technology that might even go back to the source. So it's really interesting stuff. And they call this area the morphogenetic code. And I just find it absolutely frightening. It's like my hair almost stood straight up. It's already gray, but it almost stood straight up, sort of just briefly reading over this. So do I think that that might be what is being talked about, so that it will cause this type of pain in a very specific and targeted and torturous way for 5 months? Possibly. Or it could be just a poison. But as I say, as we move into this age of technology, I think, we might want to be open to that. And then when I look at what Babylon is prophesied to do with the sorceries, the pharmakia, yeah, it may be something like that. It may be something like that. So very, very interesting question. So until today, I was not familiar with it. So I did a little bit of reading on that, and be interesting if if we are here to see that sort of unfold. I think it's going to be horrific to go through, but it could very well be something like that. But very good question.
And that is really interesting. Haven't heard of that either, so definitely have to look further into that. Thank you, Andrew, for bringing that to our attention, and thanks for connecting those dots. Really great. Let's move on to the next question that comes from Dill. What does the Bible say about sex before marriage? Does fornication mean non-marital sex?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'll answer the best I can, and I'll throw out a caveat. I'm not a minister, so I'm a researcher. So I base things on, as being a contrarian or a Berean, everything that I know about the Bible and have found and out for myself. So let's go to that word fornication. And start there, and maybe work it back so that we understand what is kind of being talked about. And so the word fornication, as it shows up in the New Testament, it comes from the Greek word porneia. So like that's where pornography, coming from Greek word porneia, would also extend out of us. So sexual immorality is how it's kind of defined. And so we get lots of references about sexual immortality in the book of Revelations, in the New Testament, and in the Old Testament. But what actually is sexual immortality? And so typically it's kind of be understood as adultery and sexual sins against the vow and the covenant within the marriage. And you also get, in terms of the fornication and the immorality, there's an allegory that's also used both in the New and the Old Testament for adultery and or harlotry, where it's a religious sort of connotation that you have the people of Israel and Judah who are committing adultery or harlotry by worshiping other gods after they swore an oath of covenant to God. And just as people understand that oath in the Holy Covenant, you have those marriage vows as well. And so it's typically understood to be bound as sexual immortality within the marriage, or what affects the marriage. And so if we look at the Hebrew words for this in the Old Testament, you get basically zana and taznawith. And they both means idolatry, adultery, harlotry, and so the same sort of words that we're talking about. So typically when we're talking about sexual immortality, it's got to do with the marriage vows and within the marriage. But the question now going back is, does that then qualify sex before marriage as being, fornication? Technically, no, it's not. But we have other verses that kind of guide us in terms of, is it permitted or is it not permitted? And in that sort of context, I'll look at the New Testament first and then bring it back to a very interesting passage in the Old Testament in the book of Exodus. So 1 Corinthians 6:18-20, it's talking about sexual immortality and the sins thereof. And it is a sexual immorality is a sin against the body, just as our body is kind of a temple. And it's the only one that's sort of reflected sort of inwards, and all the other sins in that verse is talked about as being sins outside the body. So it's a very personal thing, and stemming from the vow, I think. And then in 1 Corinthians 7:8, it talks about people that are unmarried. It is better for them to marry. It's better to be celibate, but if you're going to have a burning passion within yourself, it's better to marry so that you're not going to commit some sort of sin through that sort of passion. So there's some explicit sort of warnings to marriage outside of being married, that it's, it probably will lead to doing some other sins. But here's the most important passage for me in terms of the Old Testament. It comes in Exodus 22:16, and it's talking about a man and taking advantage of a virgin woman, and that if that's the case, then that person the male should betroth the woman and must marry them. So that, I think what is being said here is that's wrong to have had sex outside of the marriage. But if you're going to do that, then you ought to be marrying as a result of doing so. So let's say you're a long-time person with another person, but you're not married. If you're having sex, then you should be looking to consummate that so that it doesn't become sort of a sin. So again, we get sort of passages dancing around it that it's not quite right, but if it's done, you also get instructions as what you should do about it. So going beyond that into sort of a promiscuous sort of nature, I think by extension sort of becomes, a wrong and a sinful thing to do. But it may not rise to the level of not that I'm trying to create some sort of hierarchy of sins, because one sin will prevent you from being saved, unless you accept Jesus and God into your heart and earn your salvation that way. But it just doesn't rise to the fornication level, I guess, is the definition of that. So it's something you should be very, very careful with and think hard about. But it doesn't rise to the fornication level, in my opinion, based on the scripture that I'm familiar with.
Really great points. It's funny. These are the type of questions that Dr. Joy gets quite often, as an ordained minister. But for you, I think this is one of our first questions we ever had that's kind of on this level. So I appreciate you navigating that question for us, and for, of course, looking through the scriptures and bringing out the reality of the situation. So moving on to the next question, it comes from TGS Source. How does reincarnation fit in, as other tribes recognize this, as does the adversary, i.e. Blavatsky? When I died, I was my soul still alive, given choice to return.
Yeah, I think we need to be careful with the word reincarnation. And I think there's probably a lot of Christians that believe in reincarnation. Reincarnation is a polytheist doctrine, and it is I think it's pablum for the masses versus the adept and the elite and the royal bloodlines. And with this idea of reincarnation, as the typical definition kind of goes, you are permitted to come back as another human or as another animal and try and sort of get things right over and over and over. And that's not what the rituals that the adepts and the royal bloodlines perform for afterlife and things like that. They have a different path, is what they believe. And their path is that they want to, when their spirit leaves their body, they want to ensure that they're going to be able to navigate the underworld and not end up going to the abyss or being trapped roaming on the earth, so that you're thirsting for a body and you don't have a place for rest, and that you can perhaps even go back and forth by the knowledge that you've learned in these rituals that isn't permitted for the mundane masses, even of polytheism. So you're either an adept or you're not. And if you're going to be an adept, then your chances are you're going to be of the bloodlines, and that you are looking to navigate through afterlife, not coming back as reincarnated. The only way you're coming back as a demonic spirit is possession or some sort of oiketerian dwelling place for the spirit to be created, which I think is part of the technology that is being developed that we were sort of alluding to in question number 1 tonight. So do I think, how does reincarnation fit into other tribes? Well, this is, as I say, this is deception by the bloodlines and deception by the demons to deceive the mundane people so that they're not sort of rising up in rebellion, that they haven't really have a plausible answer for the masses. And so people think that when there's past lives and there's information coming through, that is somehow a sign that they've lived before. That's just demonic possession and demonic supply of that information and knowledge. So what we do know is this, is the Bible says over and over and over, New Testament and Old Testament, that we sleep when we die. And just as when Jesus found out that Lazarus had died, as one example, and it's being referenced in John 11 that that Jesus was talking about Lazarus is asleep, but Jesus was speaking of his death, and that he was. But they had thought that they were talking about. The disciples thought Jesus was talking about Lazarus in terms of actual sleeping, but Jesus clearly raised Lazarus from the dead, from the sleep that he was in. And there is a sequence to the resurrections. There's Christ, there's the first fruits. Then there's those who are still alive when he comes at the time of rapture. And you need to sort of put together First Thessalonians 4:13 on that, and 1 Corinthians 15:23 on that. And Christ is, the first fruit of those who sleep, right? And he was resurrected. And so you also have some other resurrections that'll have to do with Israel and with the people who refuse to take the mark and are resurrected in at the start of the millennium, and in recognition for that are going to rule with Jesus. So you have several of these resurrections, and that's all part of the first resurrection. The second resurrection is the resurrection of the dead at the end of the millennium to judgment and to the lake of fire or not, and I leave that to God to decide, and to Jesus, and for Jesus to decide whether or not anybody survives that or not. So we sleep. So we have three components to our nature. We have the physical body, and we have the soul, which is the part of the physical world. And then you have the spirit that is sent from heaven, and it merges with the soul. And typically we understand that as only God and Jesus can separate the spirit from the soul. But we also have an incident in the Old Testament in the time of Saul, where Saul goes to a medium and a necromancer to raise Samuel's spirit up to help him and guide him for the war he's about to fight with the Philistines. So there's a way that you can awake the spirit, but obviously, I think Samuel would have went back to sleep after that, because you have to have Christ having the first resurrection first. So when TGS is talking about when he died, and he's saying my soul was still alive and given choice to return, I mean, it's hard to know what is going on there, but and maybe even the medical signs were showing that the body was actually dead, but your spirit had not gone to sleep with the soul yet. And so that may be interesting to see what would have happened for a longer period of time after that. But typically, you're not going to have a separation of the spirit from the soul. So I would imagine that the body or your time just wasn't quite yet that it was going to be. And I'm not going to dispute what happened to you. We just don't maybe fully understand some of the possibilities of what happens in the process that sometimes can be a little bit delayed in going to that sleep. And I'm certainly not going to try and say that you are of a Nephilim bloodline or a Rephaim bloodline. I don't even want to go there, because I have no idea who you are in terms of background and your beliefs and things like that. So I'm not suggesting that either, but it is something that might be more conducive to what a somebody of the Nephilim or the Rephilim and the purebloods would go through, that would be something that happens to them as that demonic spirit might leave. And it's a similar kind of spirit to what we have, except it's a counterfeit spirit given to them by the fallen angels. But yet it will be allowed to be free of the body and the soul and to roam as a counterfeit spirit, as a demon spirit. But I don't think you would have been permitted to separate from the soul and to do that. So whether or not there was really a choice there or not, or it was maybe a test of some sort, I mean, who knows? But it's an interesting thing that you do raise. And I'm more focused on that we need to understand scripturally what the parameters of what we want to be sort of creative in our thinking of, can do, and not violate or contradict what the Bible says. And so reincarnation for me, in terms of my understanding and how I look at things and what I've researched, has nothing to do with humankind in death and sleep and then the resurrection.
Really great points. Thank you very much for sharing that answer. All right, our next question comes from Dill. Does Scripture support the idea of a Trinity? And also, what does the word begotten mean in John 3:16? Does this word imply that Jesus was not created and that he is part of God?
Yeah, it's interesting that the Trinity doctrine, that is part of the Roman Church and parts of Protestantism as well. This argument split the Eastern Orthodox Church with Rome. That's how contentious the issue is, and that was in about 1000 AD. And so it's trying to wrestle the idea of a Trinity with what is written in the Bible, and how, if they're not one, how they are different, and if they're different, how can they be one? And it's almost a chicken and an egg and a quicksand argument. So I'm going to do the best I can with it to sort of make it simple. What we do know for sure is this: is that there is God the Father, there is the Word who became flesh and is described as the only begotten Son there, that I'll get to after I get through this part of the question, and the Holy Spirit. So we know there's three, and we know they act in sync with God, that they are, and Jesus is called the reflection of God, and that they are distinct but somehow together, and that's where you really get into it. So we know there's a distinction because when the Word was made flesh, Jesus would pray to God every day, and even called to him from the cross. And we know that in Colossians 1:15, and alluded to in Hebrews 1, and definitely defined in Proverbs 8:22, that the Word is the firstborn of creation, whom God created all things through his Word, who became flesh. So we know there's a bit of a distinction there, and that I know the argument that God could be in two places at once if he wanted to, but it doesn't make sense that he would pray to himself. But they're one unit, so they are in perfect sync, and they reflect each other. And we get sort of a definition as to the distinction between the two as well in Isaiah 45:11-13, where it says, the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, and his maker. So you have the Lord as typically being sort of understood as being, coming out of Hebrew as Yahweh, or similar pronunciations, how people want to pronounce that, as opposed to being different as in God, which would be Elohim, as it's typically coming out of Hebrew, and that this Lord is the Holy One of Israel. That's talking about the Word before he becomes flesh. And it's also talking about his maker. And that this is the one that is also going to, build his um, temple and to free the captives in the end time, which Jesus leads Israel and Judah in second Exodus in the last 3.5 years. And he's referred to in Jeremiah 23 and Isaiah 1 and Jeremiah 33 as the branch. And he's like a branch from out of God. So he comes from God and he's connected to God, just as the Spirit would probably be something sort of similar as the Spirit of God. So you get these three things, these three concepts that have some independence, but in perfect harmony, even though they're distinct. And that's where you get into that sort of, circular sort of conversation. But we have to remember they're spoken of as in some respects distinct. So yes, we're talking about three. We're talking about three acting as one. We're talking about three that comes out of the one. And that's kind of the best way I can explain it. There's never going to be a separation. They are all interconnected, but there is a source, and that was the Father in terms of my research. And so when I look at that, as we look at John 3:16 about the only begotten Son that is talked about, and the question is does this word imply that Jesus was not created and that he is part of God? Well, we just talked about several verses where he is the first creation of God, but he is still part of God. But in this particular verse, as the only begotten Son, that's the Greek word monogenes, monogenes, and it's translated as begotten, as well as only, and as well as child. And what monogenes means is one of a kind, by its typical definition, and as it can be applied as only and soul. So you'll get some references that go to begotten in the New Testament that has nothing to do with Jesus. But when I look at applying monogenes to Jesus being the only begotten Son, that means one of a kind, just as the Word becoming flesh, where you have the Holy Spirit creating within Mary the body and the soul, so that there's a dwelling place or an oikotarian for the Word to become flesh without sex, but still be partly human, so that he can be atoning and conquering the world through not sinning, and also being the Lamb, to be the sacrificial Lamb as the creator and one who has not sinned for the sins of the world. It makes sense that that's one of a kind, in its most literal and superlative sense, as I would sort of put it. And Son, there's nothing too peculiar on that. That's the Greek word huios, which means son or child, and words similar to that as it's translated. But I think when we look at monogenes, this is talking about his Jesus, who is God's, one of a kind, is how I would really describe it, because it's his word that he is permitting to become flesh and sacrifice for the sins of the world, so that humankind can reach our destiny. So that's definitely one of a kind. And it has to be done that way, because you can't have God having sex with humans like fallen angels did. That would not make him absolutely pure. And he was. So this has to be done in a way that is absolutely pure. So hopefully I've answered that in a sort of clear enough way that sort of makes sense. and put a little bit underscore on begotten from its Greek word, and sort of understood in terms of what they were trying to get at with the translation of monogenes there.
Really great job with that one. Thank you very much for that answer. Our next question comes from Moed Mechanics. What do you think about the reports that there is an emergency crisis in the national parks with giants, cryptids, Nephilim, etc. coming out of cave systems like Mount Rainier? And the source that they quote is Israeli News Live. You still with us, Gary? Are you muted for a second?
Sorry about that.
No worries.
I read that question, and I have to say, I've not been able to find anything on that. Even, I Googled that, some of the words and descriptions with Israeli News Live and then just about caves, and I was not able to find a report on that. So again, obviously, if Moed has submitted it, he saw it. I just can't sort of verify that what is in there to put some sort of flesh around sort of the question. So I think that caves are sort of related to Nephilim and Nephilim kinds of creatures throughout history, and probably are to even this day. And so, if you have recreations of these creatures that are going on, that's a possibility. If you had survival of the ones before the flood, with the help of the fallen angels in the earth, off the earth, that could be part of it, or a recreation again after the flood of the same types of crimes of the creations of this kind before the flood. That would indicate that that's a possibility. And we know Nephilim and Bigfoot and little people are associated with caves and portals, and caves are associated with portals. So you get sort of a consistency to that sort of mythos about that. So, like I say, I wish I could have found the news story, but I could not. So it's really hard to comment on. And I do think that we're going to see some strange creatures, either through chimera type of technology that's creating things in the end time. I also think we probably might see actual Nephilim and Rephaim in the end time, whether or not it's through demonic spirits taking bodies of cloned bodies, or transhumanism, or things like that, or new ones being recreated. So I think we're likely to see that in the end time. And I'm kind of one of those guys who think we just might be in the fig tree generation. So I'm open. I don't want to see any of these creatures, but I'm open to the fact that we may have to experience them. And there is one interesting sort of passage in the New Testament that is really kind of interesting, and because you could take this into a way that might be somewhat related, and it comes in Revelation 6:8 with the pale horse rider, and who brings death and hell followed him. And that is, hell goes back to the the Greek word Hades. And as we were talking about with portals, they would connect Hades, which is thought to be, in the earth, but in another dimension. And a lot of lines of thought that would make some sense to a connection to that. And what's also real interesting about that, when it says that Hades followed him, is what is in Hades that would be following this angel? Because these things are coming out of the underworld, and you could get these strange sort of creatures. And it's part of the description that they're going to reap power and destruction over a fourth part of the earth, and to kill with the sword and with hunger and with death. and get this, with the beasts of the earth. Now, is that relating that what is coming out of Hades are the beasts that would be, let's say, in the earth? Or is this in conjunction to whatever comes out of Hades in the opening of the seals that is going to help cause wild beasts to turn on humankind and, start eating humankind? Certainly, we have no personal experience in our generations of a wild land. Israel, for example, they weren't allowed to take the whole land of the covenant until they were numerous enough to populate it, because God had warned them that if that was permitted, there were too few and the wild beasts would overtake them. So that might be a reference to that, or it might be that because of all of the destruction, the animals, are going to be so hungry they're going to attack men and perhaps eat men. But it could also be part of whatever comes out of Hades. So just an interesting sort of connection there that I thought of when I looked at this. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a newspaper story or an item that was reflecting what was going on in Mount Rainier and other cave systems. So, but I thought I would share that a little bit about what Revelation 6:8 has to say.
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting one. So thank you for your thoughts on that one. Next question comes from Den Tejan. Gary, have you studied into Yah's supposed wife, Asherah?
Well, I have studied Asherah. I have not studied Yah's alleged wife as being Asherah, other than the fact that that is kind of a polytheist doctrine. All of the gods of the various pantheons around the world, they would have a consort or a female goddess. So they're matched up in pairs. So let's say, like in the Sumerian pantheon, you might have Tiamat and Apsu, or Apsu, depending on which spelling that you're looking at that on as a parent god. You could have Kronos and Gaia, or Uranus and Gaia in the Greek mythology. So that's that sort of concept. And that's the Queen of Heaven and the Mother Goddess concept. And we get the Queen of Heaven in Jeremiah 7:18, 44, 44, 19, and 25 verses in chapter 44. That is a concept that's sort of part of the seven wandering stars that are worshipped of this as the main sort of seven main pantheon of the gods. And in polytheism, Sophia would be an equivalent to that as well in Gnosticism, and being this mother goddess and the source of wisdom. And so in polytheism, you raise up this female goddess, which is still an angel, just taking a female form, to being um, the Holy Spirit, as it's understood in Christianity, that provides wisdom and also provides life. So Mother Goddess and wisdom is in Sophia. So you see how they sort of make that connection. So who is Asherah? Well, Asherah is one of these Queen of Heavens, and also known as Ashtaroth, whom the city was named after that King Og in part ruled from, because he also had Edrei as part of his two ruling cities, and Astarte. And you could take the Queen of Heaven, whether it's an offspring god or a parent god, and at whatever point in time when they're ruling in whatever pantheon around the world, they would be considered a queen of heaven, just as Lilith is considered a queen of heaven. And Sibylline would have been the queen of heaven in the Sibylline religion. So it's this common sort of doctrine, and where it sort of gets wedded into being the wife of the God of the Bible is through the Canaanite pantheon. And in the Canaanite pantheon, you have El, which is the parent god, and his consort was Asherah. And Baal, who is the offspring god and ruled after the flood, also had Asherah as his consort as well. And would have been ruling with him with the Baalim gods after the flood. So El is the Hebrew word for angel, and in a capital superlative sort of sense, it would be the God of the Bible, and or Elohim capitalized and in the most superlative sense, as opposed to just being more than one God, would be the God of the Bible in the superlative sense. And so you can have Elohim as being small g plural, G-O-D-S, or you can have an angels, or you can have it as a capital G-O-D-S and reflecting for, not capital G-O-D-S, capital G-O-D for Elohim, the God of the Bible. So that's where it sort of gets wedded. And that's typically done by polytheists just to try and discredit the Bible, because they don't want to raise up the God of the Bible to being one of their most emulated parent gods. They look at the God of the Bible as being equal to other angels, but an evil angel that is narcissistic in terms of calling himself there is none like him, and as being the chief in the angelic system. And so polytheism doesn't look at him as the omnipotent God. They look at him as somebody that would be equivalent to Satan. And so they only use that pantheon in Canaan to slur God. And so I would presume that polytheism would have said that God had a wife as well as this rogue angel, but it wouldn't have been Asherah, because that is part of the sort of royal trinity of polytheism. So and so I would say don't get sort of trapped and lost into those things that polytheism tries to toss into Christianity and get you sort of wedged in small ways that they can exploit a little bit later. So have I studied Yas as supposed wife Asherah? Not in that context, only in the context of who polytheists look at Asherah as, and also understanding that the God of the Bible doesn't have a wife.
Yeah, those are really good points. Thank you for clarifying that one. It's an interesting question for sure. So let's move on to the next one. It comes from Christos Pavlov. Is there any indication in the Bible or any other reliable sources of what heaven is going to be like?
Yeah, we don't get a lot. We get a vision of heaven in Revelation, chapters 4 and 5, when John is said to come up here, and he's in the the throne of God in the assembly of God in heaven. At least in vision, he's there. So one would think that it would be an accurate sort of accounting within the vision. And so we also get heaven as described as this place where the angels dwell, but we don't get a whole lot else to describe it. We get the assembly described in Isaiah 14, that Satan wanted to rise up to the mount of the assembly and raise his throne to be up there to be like God. But we don't get a whole bunch of detail as to what's in the throne, other than the details that what Israel has provided for their own usages in the worship of God. So we get very, very limited sort of information in there in terms of what might be there. We get some candlesticks and a few things like that, but we don't get a whole lot. We don't get much about what's going on, in the heaven. And I also understand heaven is made up of three different places as you get it. It's Shama, and Shamaim is the plural. You got the first heaven, that's the firmament, that's described in Genesis 1. So everything within the firmament that is created by the separation of the water, and then everything that would include whoever how far out the sun is, whether it's 93 million miles or less. Doesn't really matter. That's what it includes, all the lights that are in it. And then you've got the rest of the universe, and then you've got the spiritual realm of heaven where God and the angels live, and that's the habitation that's talked about in Jude 1:6. So we don't get much on it. We do get in Revelation 21 and 22, we get a description of a new heaven and a new earth where God is going to dwell amongst us. But that doesn't mean that that's in heaven. That is in eternity. And it would seem that we're going to have a body that's created anew in the likeness of Jesus, just as Jesus goes with with the Word, who he is, with his Jesus flesh, as we talked about earlier, to sit at the right-hand side of God and will come back. So he's able to go back from the physical world into the spiritual world with his physical body, where that's only a spiritual place. But our bodies, when we're resurrected, are going to be like that. So I'm not saying that we won't be allowed to go into heaven, because we'll have bodies that'll be capable of doing that. But the new heavens and the new earth, which is essentially paradise that we're promised, that's talked about in Luke 23, doesn't seem to be that same place. So no, we don't get much in the Bible about that. And I would not be all that, I would be very, very careful in trying to ascribe what the spirit realm of heaven is from sources outside the Bible. But you do get a little bit more of that detail in the book of First Enoch. So that would be about the only one where I would say, read some details in there, but you're not going to get a lot there either. So
Really interesting question and some really great points that you brought up. So thank you so much for that answer. We're actually halfway through the pre-made list of 14 questions. That was question number 7. Getting ready to go into a quick break. And if you are just joining in over on YouTube, it is actually Revolution Radio that will be going into a break at the top of the hour. They do run some ads, and they are a radio station trying to stay in business. So definitely not hating on them, like the flack that we get in the chat sometimes from people who are saying that we shouldn't do promotions and stuff like that. We do have to go into a break, and we don't air their promotions on our show. So we do just have some of our own shows, or some of our own little videos that one of our brothers from South Africa put together that we played during that time. So appreciate everybody for your patience during the breaks. And thankfully on Wednesday we only have the one break, and it will last a few minutes. But right after that, we will pick up with the last 7 questions of the pre-made list before going into the live questions. So I am still monitoring the chat. If you do have any live questions, feel free to share those in the chat. Please make sure you write question at the beginning so I know that it is a question you want for the list. And it's really great to see everyone hanging out around 130 people. It's great to see you all, and I definitely understand why you're all sticking around. Brother Gary's answers are always very thorough, and definitely, once again, Brother Gary, thank you so much for coming on and offering your time. I know that you dedicate so much time to doing so many radio shows and so much information ministry, so we're glad to be a branch of your ministry, so to say. So I think earlier I didn't hear any music for the intro.
I wasn't.
You didn't hear that either?
Hearing it either there. Well, I mean, at the beginning when we first hooked up, I was hearing things, but when you came on and said that we weren't hearing, I was in the same position. I wasn't sure that we had lost connection or not, but I saw everybody else was connected, so
Same. So I think
same
that we'll go ahead and start it up. We're probably being talked over by the ads on the radio show. So we will be back in about 3.5 minutes. Thank you everybody for joining again tonight, and we'll be right back. As a bookstore for truth seekers, it's our goal to make ancient manuscripts which were once held captive by secretive institutions available for public consideration. In our generation, where wisdom has increased, as Daniel the prophet foretold, we have access to many of the testimonies our early church brethren were persecuted for preserving. After being hidden for centuries, these manuscripts have been leaked from various sources throughout the earth, and it's our goal to gather these sources into printable form to make available for all who seek the ancient way. If you're looking to deepen your studies of the biblical narrative, find these ancient manuscripts and more at sacredwordpublishing.com.
When a little girl, we named her Eliana and started dreaming of what life would be like with her, where we would take her, what we would teach her, and of course, what we would read to her. One day we walked around a bookstore looking for books we might want for her and found nothing. So we started brainstorming what exactly we would want. Even from a young age, we wanted her to know and understand the heart of God and hidden truths that are in ancient biblical manuscripts like the Book of Enoch, and the idea of the Prophecy for Children series was born. Justin got hard to work, and praise Yah released the Prophecy for Children series. We are grateful for the support and amazing feedback from others who have been wanting the same for their children. We just found out we will be having a son, and we are excited to grow our family and to keep writing books for our children to share with our truth-seeking family. To order these books today, please check out the children's store at sacredwordpublishing.com.
Your partnership with Sacred Word Publishing goes further than the publishing of ancient manuscripts and weekly video content.
You also make a huge impact across the earth in orphanages in Myanmar, India, Uganda, and Kenya.
Your support is crucial for the development of the ecclesia of real truth seekers.
We thank you for joining us in hosting Secrets Revealed, Momentary Zen, the Digital Readers Club, Ask Me Anything series, and other shows that have helped lead so many to the truth of salvation.
To become even more involved, please visit patreon.com/sacredwordpublishing, where you can partake in exclusive, interactive, patron-only content and help us continue shining the light of love in this darkened world. All right, welcome back, everybody. Prayerfully, I'm live over on Revolution Radio. Not sure, we can't hear the actual studio for some reason. Can't hear the music over there. But I think this is around the time 9:03 where the ads end and show resumes. So prayerfully, I have that lined up properly. But over there on YouTube, thank you again for your patience. Yeah, we'll get into the live questions here. In 1 second, I am still acquiring questions for the live question list that we'll get into after the pre-made questions are all done with. So make sure if you do have a question you would like to present to Brother Gary, that you write it in there. And I got some really, really good questions so far. If we don't get to your questions at the end of the show during the live questions, we will roll over the questions from the live chat tonight to next month's pre-made list. So keep that in mind. If you don't get your question asked tonight, make sure you join us next month. And the chances are we will about 99% positively answer your question on that show. All right, let's jump back over here and welcome Brother Gary back. Are you still with us?
I am.
All right, glad to hear it. Thank you again for joining. And just in case we have some new people joining in, could you please let us know where we could get a copy of your awesome book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy?
Yeah, the best place is from my website, the Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's the number 6conspiracy.com. And on the website, I have a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters. And when my new book comes out, which will be a sequel to it, which will be pretty much all new information, but totally related to what's in the first book, it'll be available at the same place. I'm on chapter 65, so I'm hoping to keep it to about 75 to 80 chapters. So still hoping to have it out this year, but I'm my own worst enemy. But that's the best place to get a hold of my book. And on there is a buy now icon, and you can buy a signed copy from me there, or you can also from the buy page click over to Amazon.com, Amazon.ca, BarnesandNoble.com, and also over to get the Kindle version. And I have 3 pages there for Canadians, one's for Canada, one's for the US shipping, and one's for overseas. So you can also probably get it on most online bookstores. That it's still available, and through your local bookstore as well. If you wanted to support your local bookstore, and I'm a fan of that. The book is distributed through Bookmasters out of Pennsylvania, which my publisher, Deep River, uses. And so if you wanted to order it through them, through the bookstore, they can buy it through Bookmasters and get it shipped into you.
Excellent. Definitely encourage everyone, if you haven't checked that out, definitely at least go and browse through the contents. There's definitely a lot of great information. I know the summer just started for most people who are in school or teachers, and just for everyone who's planning on taking a vacation, it's a great book to sit down with. You might want to take like at least a 2-week long vacation to get through it all, but even if you just have it accompany you during your normal time off, it is an awesome book that will definitely keep you interested, and you will definitely learn some very interesting things. So let's jump back over into the questions. This next question comes from Mary. What connection does the Masonic order and Job's daughters have with the Testament of Job, and are the archons in the Testament of Job fallen angels?
Okay, I'm going to take the last part of that question first. So we get like angels in Job 1:6 and 2:1 that are presenting themselves at the assembly of God in heaven, and Satan joins them. So Satan is separated from those angels that are presenting them. And so Satan has already been degraded for the rebellion as being a fallen angel to Satan's status. So my interpretation of those 2 verses would be that Satan is an ex-archon, and one of his many titles, but the rest of those angels there, I think, would be the loyal angels. Now, when you go to Job 38, verses 4 through 7, you've got the morning stars and the sun as well. And I think that is before creation of the earth, because they're celebrating the creation. And so I think that is before the rebellion, so that would include some of the archons there. But typically, I don't think there's. I mean, I don't get archon that comes up in the Book of Job. So typically, that would be the best place if you wanted to put some fallen angels included in Job, that you could say pretty clearly that some of those would have been some of the rebellious ones that rebelled after creation. So as far as the first question goes, I mean, there are a few orders in Masonry with women, like the Eastern Star, and in the Royal Masonic orders that are way above Freemasonry and above the Rosicrucians. You would have orders of females. They play a very, very important role in the Royal Masonic orders, in the purebloods. And so they would have had some of their own orders, I would think, as well. So when you have this order that's related to the daughters of Job. Understand that Masons look at Job in a little bit different sort of way, just as they like to draft most of the patriarchs in the Bible and sort of corrupt it into their own sort of belief system. Job, they would be classifying as a royal bloodline, and they would be classifying him as having significant wisdom and a very, very sort of important person within their history. But again, not as understood the way we would with Job in the Bible, a little bit differently. So the book of Job, in Job 42, verses 7 to 17, and particularly 42:14, you have three daughters of Job, Jemima, Keziah, and Karen Happak. And these are very beautiful daughters, and they are the fairest in the land. So they are quite beautiful. And they are provided part of Job's inheritance, along with 7 other brothers, which is very sort of an unusual thing. But these ones were considered to be given this special sort of blessing. Now, in the Masonic traditions, there is something called T-Job, and it has, and literally if you Google T-Job, capital T-J-O-B, it'll talk about this narrative that sort of is an addition to the book of Job. And in chapter 46, 7 through 9, it has a bit of an addition. So this is not scriptural, but this would be sort of one of the reasons why they look at Job and the daughters as being sort of very, very important, and sort of at the crux of answering the question on how they draft individuals into the Bible into their own sort of making and reimagine them and add things to the mythos to be kind of polytheistic in nature. So each of the three daughters in Job 46 verses 7 through 9 receive cords or girdles. And this cord is an attachment to be able to speak to and in the dialect of angels. And it also provides them an ability to see the invisible ones, the angels, and the chariots of the angels that, aren't normally seen. So they're given some gifts, and they are given an additional blessing, or as part of what they would say the blessings that were received in the inheritance from Job. They receive a protection from the enemy, which would be fallen angels as we would understand them, but as being understood within polytheism, protection from the angels of God. One would. A lot of people think, well, they would be protected here because they're so fair, and that they would be, protected from being forced into copulation to create new Nephilim or Rephaim. At that, and say, blood and his daughters and fairy dragon bloodlines, then they're already the offspring of fallen angels, and so that's why they're so fair. Just as you get the fairy queens, it's all part of that same sort of allegory, and it won't go down that. So it would seem that they're receiving protection from the angels of heaven, because in this aspect, the polytheist aspect, with their ability to speak to angels and see the invisible ones, they would need protection because they're probably trying to interfere with what God's angels are trying to do. So that seems to be the basis of what this order. And so I have a lot of research as to how high up this order would be. But if you have the ability to, and they're naming it after Job's daughters on this belief system, if you have the ability to talk in the various angelic languages and you have special protection, then they are working probably against God's will for a time that they're still permitted, and they would be adepts, and they would have to be, as women and adepts, of a very high pure blood where they're initiated from childhood to be an adept. So that's, I mean, I'm not part of the secret societies, so I have to sort of piece things together, but that's how I would sort of take the root of that order back to, and what I think their sort of mission is, because every person in the Royal Masonic and Royal Bloodlines have specific jobs and duties and are assigned to be in specific orders. So I think that that's probably getting into the zone as to what that order would be all about.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that answer. Our next question comes from Pale Rider. Please ask Gary if he believes through his research that some top bloodlines are in direct contact with the fallen, and why he believes that.
Well, I definitely believe that. And so as I said, as mentioning in the question before, if you're of a pure bloodline, you are going to be initiated right from childhood, and that you're going to play a significant role in the earthly hierarchy as the visible ones and the representatives of the fallen angels, of the council of gods that Psalm 82 talks about, and the 70 nations that they're allowed to govern over. So if we understand that, and then we understand that they're going to be an adept before adulthood, and even though they may not be recognized, so you might hear some references like a 32nd degree adept. That's either somebody who's talking BS because it's 33rd degree to become an adept in the Scottish Rite, or they're referring it to a pureblood who is an adept but isn't yet ready to accept that title, and are not allowed to be called an adept until it's somewhere in the mid-20s to early to 30 years old, as I recall, when they would be allowed to become recognized as an adept. And that sort of makes sense of like Lewis and Tolkien, that they're in Oxford and they're of royal bloodlines, and I've got documents on that if people want that. So I won't spend too much time, but just hold me through the website and I'll send you those documents. And that they are in a Golden Dawn Rosicrucian order while going to university. And there's no way you could be in that order unless you're a Rosicrucian or at least a Freemason. They're not recognized to be a Freemasons, but they're in there to learn their craft because they're adepts that have been initiated from childhood. They're going to communicate their occult languages through learning the artful skills of literary to write these fabulous stories that unfortunately are based all in polytheism. But that would be sort of an example of that. And as an adept, where I'm going with this now, particularly the higher you go, so certainly the royal bloodlines, the pure ones, in the upper orders from the, upper half of the Rosicrucians, the top 50%, into the Committee of 300, into the Council of 33, and into the family, the 13 families, and understand those 300 is kind of like 300 families. There's more allegories to it than that, but there's a lot of families of bloodlines that have come down through the generations. These ones who have these high-level degrees, they are taught how to communicate with these spiritual beings. And there's two different kinds for sure. There are the demons and there's the fallen angels, and then there's possibly the other ones like the elementals and other creations that are sort of working within the hierarchy as well, that they might be communicating as. And so you get a variety of names of who they're speaking to: spiritual guides, aliens, Great White Brotherhood, the Ascended Masters, the Celestial White Brotherhood, and on and on and on. And these could be part of a hierarchy of the invisible ones that they're speaking to. And the aliens, of course, would be physical beings that they're communicating with, but they're still part of that sort of physical hierarchy. So do I think that they communicate with those beings? Yes, I do. And I think that's part of how Nazi Germany receives all of their technology so quickly, whether it was the blitzkrieg strategy, the ability to design tanks that we still use that model on, to this day, to create the rocket engine, to create the jet engine, to create single winged aircraft, and all of these technologies that they were receiving was coming through the leadership who were rogue theosophists, which is an extension, it's theosophy and an extension of Gnosticism of the secret societies, and they're partly formed the Nazis through rogue theosophy, which is Ariosophy, and secret societies to create the Nazis, and leading them were adepts. And they said they were speaking to these spiritual guides, and they were receiving the technology from them, and then how they developed it. And it was really interesting because in the Nuremberg trials and other trials, Winston Churchill ruled that they would not be able to be permitted to talk about all of their occult connections and speaking to these spiritual beings, because he felt it would enable them to plead insanity. And so it was kept top secret till the late 90s, where this information started to come out after the expiry date on the Secrecies Act for those documents. So yeah, the simple answer is yes, and that's why.
Really interesting information. Thank you for sharing that. Our next question comes from Matt C. And he asked, what are the two worlds mentioned in 2nd Ezra, chapter 7, verse 50?
Yeah, really good question. So, and it literally says that God created two worlds in chapter 7. And it is, in fact, what it actually says, for this reason, the Most High has made not one world, but two. And then you get a fair bit of information that's talking about the judgment, and that the earth was made for the many. And you start to think, well, maybe the two worlds that are being talked about, one is, the physical earth that we know, and then the other one would be where the people are going to be judged are going to be going after judgment into the lake of fire. Maybe that's the other world. And that's a distinct possibility, but I think chapter 8, verse 1 actually answers the question for us on that. And it says, and I'll just read it. It says, he answered me and said, the Most High made this world for the sake of many, but the world to come for the sake of only a few. So what is being talked about these two worlds is that you have this period of time where you have all of these humans that are going to be brought into the world and whose names are written into the book of life from before creation. And it's going to be permitted through free choice for people to leave their names in the book of life or have them erased or blotted out. And so the second world is for the few, the names who remain in the book of life. And I think the second world is what we were talking about earlier in the show in Revelation 21 and 22, where you get a new heavens and a new earth. This would be the physical heavens, in the firmament and outside the firmament, and with a new earth, and where God is going to dwell amongst us. And it seems likely, if Second Ezra, and it is part of the Apocrypha, so you do have to be a little bit careful, but it's part of the old King James Version Apocrypha, so it's probably more accurate than some of the other Apocrypha that's out there. It may be that God created this new heaven and earth before creation as well, and that it will be presented after the millennium, and that's the second world that he's talking about. So for me, it's one of the two. I lean for the second. It could be the lake of fire, where all of the dead will be sent to for the second death, and where the fallen angels and the demons are going, and Satan, and all of those who take the mark of the beast or worship Antichrist or worship Satan in the last 3.5 years. But I think it's more likely is the second world that God created, and by these words it would mean, in the beginning, which was reserved for the denouement and the end of the the age of humanity as the resolution to the angelic rebellion. So I think it's my gut feeling is it's the new earth and the new heaven that's coming at the end of the millennium.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that answer. Definitely makes a lot of sense. Our next question comes from Christoph Pavlov. Why do many of the writers of the New Testament have European sounding names as opposed to Hebrew sounding names, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, and Paul?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's because we transliterate the names into our language. And so they change over time in the transliterations in terms of the spelling and the pronunciation to a certain degree. So if you understand that, and if you had access to like a Strong's Concordance or something like that, where you can take the word back to the original Greek or the original Hebrew, you'll see that sort of original spelling. So I like, if I were to use the word Matthew, for example, that would be Matthias, as it would come out of Greek. And Mark and Matthew tends to be more of a latter name. It doesn't seem to have a Greek. We don't get a Greek example, or I mean a Hebrew example in the Old Testament that I'm aware of it. And Mark, for example, again, essentially a newer kind of name and seemingly not connected back to one in Hebrew that we receive a direct reference for anyways, would be Marcos or Marcus. The best examples, though, is like John has a Greek version and a Hebrew version, for example. And so the Greek would be the J as being an I and pronounced as an I. So it wouldn't be, John or Johann. It would be Johann. So Ioannes, as we would spell it out of the Greek. And in Hebrew, it would be Yowchanan, with the CH being the C being silent in the CH. So just as Horim is spelled CH or RIM in Hebrew for the Horim giants, this would be Johann. In Paul, that is actually, Paulos, and is the name that is taken from Saul, and Saul is a Hebrew name, Shaol, SHAOWL would be the Hebrew spelling. So again, short translation, I just wanted to give some examples to sort of back things up with the examples that were provided by Christos, is that's just English transliteration. I would prefer that all the names would be done in the original Greek or in the original Hebrew, because I think we lose something in the meaning and in the translation when they're translated into English transliterations.
Yeah, there's definitely interesting points. Thank you for sharing that one. Our next question, definitely an interesting one as well, comes from Johan. Why did Cain need a mark if he was 50% seraphim and clearly distinguishable?
Well, that has an assumption in there that Cain would have been the offspring of Satan and Eve, and the serpent seed doctrine and theory that people have. Although seraphim may not be quite the accurate word, even though Satan would be seraphim as well as an archon or an archangel. He's also described in Ezekiel 28 as cherubim. So if that was the case, he would be, 50% of this combination of whatever Satan was. If he was, as in some of the Gnostic accounts, you get some of the watchers other than Satan who are raping Eve, and if that's the offspring that he would have been of, then probably seraphim would be accurate there. I'm not a fan of the of Cain being the offspring of Satan or another angel. I'm not against it. I just can't make it scripturally, but that's another rabbit hole. But if people want, I have a 4-part series that walks through all of the arguments, all of the original words. If you want that, get a hold of me and you can make up your own mind on that. It's an excellent series and it's got a lot of information in there. And I would recommend it for people. So the question, though, is that why would Cain need it if he was 50% seraphim? Because that means he would have been a giant, right? And then that would also presuppose there would be probably other giants, because he certainly wouldn't be afraid of the descendants of Adam and Eve unless they were giants, and we don't have scripture for that. Typically, I understand that, in my understanding, in my research in the Bible, I look at Cain requiring the mark because he is the offspring of Adam and Eve, and he's going to live for a long period of time, and there are going to be giants created down the road in Genesis 6, yes, that he would probably be alive for, but I think he's going to be afraid of the other people that are likely there on the earth, because when he moves to Nod after he's ostracized, and he actually finds a wife and he builds a city and he has a son, and who is he building a city for? I think these are the people of day 6. And we also know that Seth isn't born until Adam is 130 years old, and then sometime later other sons and daughters are born. And one presumes that the offerings that Abel and Cain were offering is early adulthood at some point in time, and that those were first fruit offerings, and why Cain didn't offer the first fruits is why it wasn't accepted, and that he would have been ostracized at a reasonably young age. So who did he find? Without being in contradiction, and there's way more contradictions than that, and I have a great document on the difference between day 6 and the Eden account so that people know what I'm talking about. And I don't believe the Bible contradicts itself, so it seems to me there's 2 creations, one in day 6, and then Adam and later Eve for a special commission to be the resolution to the angelic rebellion and a resolution to what the fallen angels did to the people of day 6 and led them into complete polytheism. And so Adam is born sometime after day 7 for that Great Commission. So I think that's who he receives the mark for, is to sort of ward other human beings who might be there in great numbers and saying, you're not from our tribes or from our race. And that's for the protection from those people. So that's how I would sort of understand that, Johan. And I understand that we may agree to disagree on whether or not Cain was the offspring of Satan and Eve. Like I say, I'm not against it. I can make a case sometimes for it, but what I can't do is make a case that doesn't contradict other portions of the Bible. And that's where I'm open to it, but I can't make the case through the Bible.
Yeah, that's definitely respectable. Thank you very much for that answer. Our next question comes from Sana. Isaiah 13 verses 2 through 3. I've read in the Brenton's Septuagint translation that it says, "Lift up a standard on the mountain of the plain, exalt the voice to them, beckon with the hand, open the gates, you rulers. I give command and I bring them. Giants are coming to fulfill my wrath, rejoicing at the same time and insulting." Is God going to use giants during his end time wrath to destroy Babylon? Can you explain what's happening in Isaiah 13? Might have lost you again. No worries. If you need a water break, please feel free. Take some time. We appreciate you joining in. Given all this information.
I was having a nice drink there. Sorry. My voice is starting to tire a little bit. So, it's a great question, because if somebody read the Septuagint, I mean, that's what it says. And you would think that God was going to use giants and that there are good giants, and then that he would have somehow blessed the idea of angels who procreated for God with human beings to create giants, and that they would be fighting for him in the end time. So that seems to me a little bit contradictory. And the Septuagint is not always as accurate as what it ought to be, even though it has older surviving manuscripts. It certainly isn't the Masoretic text that comes down through the rabbis. The King James Version was translated from in the Old Testament for the most part. Although the Septuagint was referenced, it wasn't used as a translation because typically it has too many errors in it. I have a document on that if people want that as well, just a little bit of information on how the Bible was translated. So when you get into it then, and taking that back to the original Hebrew, it starts to make sense why the Septuagint gets there to a certain degree with the word giant. And it also helps us to understand why we have to be careful on some of the translations. So when you look at Isaiah 13:2, God, first of all, he commands his sanctified ones. So these are going to be either blessed giants or probably going to be, the other version might be angels. And sanctified ones is Hebrews 69:42, Kadash, which means clean, pure, holy, sacred, consecrated. So typically, these are going to be loyal angels as you would understand the consecrated ones. And as you get into it in Isaiah 13:2, and I don't have the verse in front of me, but it says that I'm gonna bring up the verse so I don't mess this up. Just bear with me just for a second. You have to look at that word mighty ones, and that's going to go back to the Hebrew word gibor and gibborim. And so gibborim can mean giant, or it can mean things like mighty, or it can mean things like strong. It doesn't always translate as giant. But the Septuagint has a biases to its own culture and its own sort of prehistory, and that's always important to remember when you're reading in the Septuagint. So keep that in mind, that they had giants in their prehistory that were titans and or heroes, and that they would look at the words like mighty one as being those heroes of old. And so they would naturally look at gibborim as always being, translated as giant. And actually, giant is translated once into specifically giant in the King James Version Bible when you get into the book of Job. And so whether or not that's accurately translated or not, and I'm not saying in that case it isn't accurately translated, but it does come from the word gibborim, and it's talking about somebody that could be a giant. So we have to be sort of open to that. So now as we sort of move forward on that, where it says, after it says, I've commanded my sanctified ones, it says, I have also called my mighty ones for mine anger. So it gets similar to what the Septuagint is translating, except for you have mighty ones instead of giant. So you have to look at where it says, I have also. Those words are inserted by the translators. They do not have a Hebrew word that corresponds. And then it has the word called. You have a Hebrew word there. And then you have my mighty. Those two words have been inserted. And then ones, which does have a Hebrew word. So it would really say, have commanded my sanctified ones, and sanctified has been inserted as well, but the word ones goes back to kadad for being sanctified or sacred. Blank out the I have also, so my sanctified ones called gibborim. is how it would be in there. And what's interesting, as I said earlier, is that Gibborim can also be translated in conjunction with angels. So if you go over to Psalm 103:20, it says, to the effect, and paraphrasing to a certain degree, that angels that excel in strength. Excel is that word Gibor. So you have strength, is the Hebrew word koach, but excel is the word connecting back to angels in this case, and in conjunction with strength, just as you're getting the mighty ones here that God is going to be commanding in the end time. And you have in Psalm 24:8, where the Lord is also strong and mighty goes back to the word Gibor. So you can use that for God and for the word, as it translates from Gibor in terms of mighty or strong or strength, as it talks about God's strength in the Old Testament. So you have to be careful of the application. So the other thing I would look at here is, in all end time prophecy, we do not have giants being utilized by God in what happens in the end time. And the best example would be in Revelation, where you get all of these angels that are opening up scrolls and blowing trumpets and pouring the wrath bowls and many other things that angels are talked about. You don't have giants there. So I think when you look at how does it fit with other scripture, what is being talked about within the context of the sentence and the verse, I think it's talking about angels and not giants. And that just underlines one of the reasons why I like the Septuagint, but I'm very, very careful with it because it does have some translation issues.
That's a really interesting point that you bring up. Thank you so much for that. We are moving into our last question for the night, the pre-made list. This one comes from Cherokee Troutman. Regarding when we die and go to sleep, most Christians have uneasy feelings about that statement. To die, but to die in Christ is to be with God. Looking at this, God is outside time, and He keeps us until the resurrection. We think of sleep as some kind of suspended place until God is ready, but it could be we died in an instant and we were resurrected, not knowing earthly time may have passed 1,000 years or months for the person who died in Christ. Much like when you go to bed at night, your physical body sleeps 6 to 8 hours, and you wake up and it feels like it was a few minutes ago you just laid down. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, good thinking here. And I do think there would be something to the notion that it would be, like sleeping, that it sort of goes by in an instance, even though there's, a large period of time. So you may not, realize any time has passed, but you're not actually with God and Jesus until you're resurrected. And that's the big thing to sort of keep in mind. And those who die in Christ, those are the ones that are, to me, it's more like a specific term for the people who are resurrected at the time of the rapture. And we covered this off a little bit earlier. So, for me, First Thessalonians 4:13 through 16 and 1 Corinthians 15:20 to 23 sort of, identifies the sleep sort of aspect of this, and the fact that, that there will be those who are still asleep at the time of the rapture. They're going to be resurrected. So if we put the two verses together, you get that resurrection sequence. And I won't go through all of them. I'll just go up to Christ, the first fruits, and then when He comes, those who are, which is talked about in 1 Corinthians 15:23, and then in 1 Thessalonians 4:15, it talks about those who are alive to the coming of the Lord, which those who are, that was in 1 Corinthians 15:23, and those who are still asleep are going to be resurrected. And so I think what we need to keep in mind is that sort of sleep nature thinking about him as being asleep, and that's what confused the disciples to a certain degree until they realized that he was referring to death as sleep, and he had resurrected Lazarus. So, I mean, he wasn't with Jesus at that time. Now, this is before the resurrection, so you could make an argument, okay, well, there's no resurrections until after Jesus, but I think it's quite clear that there isn't any resurrections until after Jesus is resurrected. We have graves that are the first fruits at that time, and certainly we have the 24 elders in Revelation 4 and 5 that would be part of the first fruits. We have the first fruits that are in Revelation 6 who were martyred, and they're told to wait until those who come out of the tribulation, the first 3.5 years, who are going to be martyred like them. So there's the resurrection of them as well, who are also part of the first fruits. And you also have the first fruits of the two witnesses and the 144,000 as are classified in Revelation 14 and Revelation 11. So you have those resurrections that happen at different periods of time. And so we might die in Christ, which is sort of how we're described as accepting Jesus and God, but not being martyred. And that therefore not part of the first fruits, and we're part of a specific resurrection that takes place in the last 7 years of this age. So I think it will feel like that, but we're not with God when we die.
Excellent. Thank you very much for all of the answers for the pre-made question list for tonight. So that was the pre-made list of 14 questions we've just completed. And now it's time for my favorite time of the night, at least, the pop quiz. So our first question comes from Facts Not Fiction. Gary, who do you think listens to your shows? Please provide some varied demographics, for example, 10% Illuminati, 10% other researchers, etc. Interesting question.
Well, I have no idea, and I have no analytics on that, and I have never even taken any time to do so. My only analytics would be people who contact me, and I would say, well over 60% are Christians. I would say there's a number of people in the New Age, and there are some that are part of the secret societies. The secret societies would be a lot smaller portion. I do a lot of shows that are not Christian shows. I do shows that I try and reach into the polytheist and secular markets to try and reach people, to get them interested in the Bible. So probably one of the reasons, in terms of some of the things I hit on, sort of gets their interest, and they'll get a hold of me, not always in a pleasant way, but sometimes they're saying, hey, what you said made some sense, and you created some interest for me to maybe have a closer look at what's in the Bible. So that's what I'm trying to do. So, but it's fairly heavily Christian, but I don't spend any time in terms of trying to figure out who my demographics are. I'm just trying to get information out there.
Yeah, that's interesting. But I guess if you had your own YouTube channel, maybe you could see where people were from. But
Yeah.
It doesn't tell you,
Yeah.
how many viewers today are Illuminati. I guess if you're in the YouTube live stream, if you are from the Illuminati, please raise your hand and let us know. And our moderators will quickly take care of you. So next question comes from Izzy Bernal. What is your thoughts on the serpent seed doctrine? I guess we already talked about this one. Did you want to cover a little more, or should we move on to the next?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just touch on it, is that I'm a contrarian, and I like to verify things for myself, and I don't believe the Bible is in contradiction. And so I just think that, what's written in the Bible, and particularly as you take it back to Hebrew, and then portions where you have a reference to the serpent in the New Testament, and take that back to Greek as it's referencing to Eden, that there's too many contradictions in it. And you get into too many conundrums with trying to fit things in with possible translations that doesn't make sense within the sentence that it's in and the paragraph that it's in, or within the chapter that it's in, or within the rest of the book, and all of that sort of has to fit. So between trying to be creative with the translation and with the metaphors through those translations, it gets into issues that I can't resolve. So, which is why I have that part document where I walk through it all. And again, to me, it doesn't really matter whether or not he's the offspring of Satan or not. I just can't get there without those contradictions and yeah, I guess that's really for me why I'm not against it, but I can't make the case.
Right on. Our next question comes from MJM. Gary, if it could be proven the 6-Day War to retake Jerusalem was a total hoax, could this possibly negate that we're in the fig tree generation?
So if I understood the question correctly, is if the 6-Day War was a hoax or a fake, would that negate that we're in the fig tree generation? Is that the question?
Yes.
No, I don't think it would negate it at all. I mean, the Bible doesn't say how Jerusalem is going to end up in the southern kingdom's hands again, only that Israel and Judah is going to be in control of Jerusalem for end time prophecies to be fulfilled. And so for me, that has to be in place. It doesn't matter how that were to come about. And so we do have Jerusalem in control of by the current nation of Israel, which is the visible remnant of Judah. Whether or not they're all the remnant of Judah or not really the point. There's at least a remnant there that has control over Jerusalem that God is going to fight for. And again, I think that would be the best plausible case if we are in the fig tree generation, that would be the starting point. But I don't think it really matters how they get a hold of it, because everything's allowed through free choice, and God, being Alpha Omega, knows how everything's going to play out. So he's allowing things to play out through humankind's free choice and angelic free choice for a while, and it's going to play out that way. So I don't think that really matters how that comes about, only that they're there at that time.
A really great question, great point. Moving on to the next one that comes from Kara Burris. Does it mean you aren't going to heaven if you're a bloodline descendant of the fallen angels?
Physical attributes don't dictate, in my understanding of the Bible, whether or not you're going to go to heaven or not. And the only caveat I might have on that, and I'll leave that up for God and for judgment as I always do, is that, even in an Old Testament law, the sins of the father don't go beyond fourth generation. So even after you have 4 generations, you wouldn't be held accountable for the sins of your father. But even the father, as a Nephilim or a Rephaim, they didn't have a choice whether or not they were going to be created that way or not. They were created by fallen angels and human women, whether or not they chose to or not, and willingly or not, they're still part of it, and that's the creation. But the offspring has a choice. And so if they would have chosen God and followed in God's way and in the way of the word, then who knows? And certainly with Jesus being made flesh, as the word being made flesh in the resurrection, that anybody who believes in Jesus, and this would get to the bloodlines, that they're not responsible receiving their physical characteristics. So if they accept Jesus as their Savior and God as their God and try and fulfill his ways, then as the Spirit manifests into them, they will, their works will, they'll produce fruits. They would be saved. So no. And I know that in the secret societies and the royal bloodlines, they try and brainwash their offspring that there's nothing that they can do, so they might as well be willing participants. But God can veto that. Follow if you follow God and accept Jesus, he vetoes all of that. And so, I mean, we have one instance in the book of Jude where Moses is being claimed by Satan after he dies because he would have sworn oaths at Heliopolis to the pantheon of gods and to Satan. And so God sent Michael and vetoed it. So faith in God and faith in Jesus can veto anything. So no, they're not automatically condemned. I don't think that's my belief anyways.
I definitely agree with that one. Thank you very much. It is 9:55. I think we only have 2 or 3 minutes left. Let's try to get through one more question. I think we can get through this one pretty quick. That's from Stevie DeStefani. Who do you suspect the Antichrist is?
I have no idea. I think we're going to see multiple antichrists, as Mark 13 and Matthew 24 talk about in the epistles of John, that there'll be multiple antichrists. And so there's going to be many that people are going to point at very, very quickly. I think you're going to have antichrists show up from around the world. I also believe that the polytheists in the West of the secret societies and the royal bloodlines, they keep 3 antichrist figures on the go all the time for when the time is right. There's rivalries between these bloodlines as well. I think if you look at it from sort of a Western kind of antichrist figure, you're going to get certain families that may want to produce it, like the ones who currently own the King of Jerusalem title, which is currently held by the Bourbon family of Spain and King Philippe. And the rival Anjou families and bloodline who claim that King of Jerusalem title that was first crowned in 1118 with Baldwin II. Actually, Baldwin I in 1100 was probably the first one. Godfrey didn't exactly receive the title, even though he was the original first leader of the Kingdom of Heaven, starting in 1099, but he only lasted a year. So I think there's the Anjou bloodlines. I think there's several all around the world that will make the claims. So, and I think there's a lot of other bloodline families, whether or not it comes from the Stuart kingships or it comes from, the Habsburg Lorraine, which is part of the King of Jerusalem title. They just don't hold it right now. There's a lot of different bloodline families. So I would hate to make a guess on that.
Really interesting. Any countries that you're looking at that might potentially be the head or the whore that sits on the Babylonian beast? Who would you identify that as?
Well, I look to Daniel 8 and the extension out of the Greek Empire, but does that mean that he's Greek or Macedonian, or does that mean he's just within the Greek Empire? I would look into that sort of zone of an area, because it goes right from talking about Alexander the Great to the Antichrist, right? It's like, so there's a connection there somehow, some way. So I would look within the Greek Empire.
Yeah, really interesting. So thank you so much again, Brother Gary, for joining in and for answering all these awesome questions from the chat. We still have 11 questions that will be rolling over to the show for next month. So please do join us next month. Next month, the first Wednesday of every month. Let me pull a date out for you. We still can't hear the music over on Revolution Radio, so I'm assuming that it's probably the end of the show now. But on the 6th of July, about a week before Joy and My Son is due. Maybe we'll be able to do that next AMA then. If he arrives a little bit early, like Eliana did, we'll see what happens. But we should be able to hold that Ask Me Anything, and we definitely appreciate the time that you give, Brother Gary. Thank you so much for joining in for this show, and thank you everybody for joining. Please do make sure you go to Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's with the number 6conspiracy.com, and check out that awesome book and the research that Brother Gary offers over there. Thank you again. And any last words you'd like to share with the audience before we jump out of here?
No, I think it was a good show. A lot of great questions. Loved to see the interest, and hopefully we answered some questions.
Yeah. Thank you again for joining, and we'll see you all next time. Shalom, and God bless you all. Good night.
Night.
Every day, questions arise.
Are the stories in the Bible true?
What if I told you that there are hundreds of confirming witnesses,
which give intricate detail to the stories in the Bible?
Have you ever found yourself deep in the rabbit hole with questions that no one seemed to have the answers to?
Check out swpcalendar.com to see when to join us for our next Ask Me Anything series with author and researcher Gary Wayne, as he sheds light on the mysteries which have us all searching together.